Thank you so much, Cindy, and thank you for the organizers for inviting me to give a talk on evidence synthesis and the use of AI in this. I'm assuming, okay, great. So here's my disclosures. So evidence-based policy, I think that ultimately this is all of our goal. We want to make sure that the policies we're putting forward are based on the latest, greatest evidence that we have in hand. But of course, as policymakers in the room will be highly familiar with, this is a delicate balancing act, and the balance is rarely achieved perfectly. At Health Canada, we have a saying that if no one's happy with your policy, you probably found the right compromise. You have to take into consideration, you're thinking about the science, but you're also thinking about other economic impacts, other impacts on other agri-food chain endpoints, other trade relationships that you have to take into consideration. So there's a lot of thinking that needs to go on. And so there are trade-offs, and the trade-offs are inevitable. And that's why ideally you'd look at all of the evidence across all of those considerations in such a way that is methodologically sound and allows for standardization of evaluations across those endpoints so you can compare them and make those balances accordingly. It requires judgment. And so that's also a lot of consideration has to go into what things will come out on top, what's going to be prioritized. And because we are putting judgment into this, hopefully evidence-based policy, you want to make sure that your decisions are transparent. So if you're making a judgment, the economic impact of this particular policy is maybe more important than the risk that's associated if you don't move forward with it. And then, of course, you also have beliefs, preferences, and values. And these are considerations that go into policy making. A policy in one jurisdiction has to take into consideration of that particular context, which may not be the same of somewhere else. But this is not the place where you put beliefs, preferences, and values when you're thinking about the science itself. The science should be interpreted and synthesized and reviewed independent of beliefs, preferences, and values. And together, they will ultimately be used to inform policy. The reason that we don't want to have these things influence the way that we look at the scientific evidence is because that can risk confirmation bias, that can risk cherry picking the studies that you want to support your beliefs, preferences, and values. Doesn't mean they don't have a role to play in policymaking, but it should not be involved in the evidence review and synthesis. And that's where systematic review methodology comes into play. So this is a transparent, rigorous methodology that allows us to look at the totality of the evidence. And this, in 2015, the National Academies had a report published that essentially said this: when you're thinking about assessing the evidence of the food system, nutrition, and health, you really need to emphasize that you want to analyze all the evidence that's available, and you want to synthesize it, but you want to do it in a rigorous, transparent way. And so I think a lot of you would be familiar, I think everybody's familiar with systematic reviews, and these really have become foundational to policymakers and committees that are making recommendations, especially with food and nutrition policies. The reason that we use them is because it's transparent. We know what the methodology is a priori. We register them in advance. And it allows for reproducibility of the results because everything is reported transparently. It allows us to reduce the bias because of the rigorous methodology that's applied. And it also allows for consistency and reliability of the results. So if one group is performing a systematic review, the methodology applied by another group should come out with virtually the same result. And this increases trust in science. So I think it's important that we think about that, especially in this context of pop science out there, and which is really degrading the trust in the policies that we're making. Now, the problem is systematic reviews, if you've ever done one, are really time consuming and they are resource intensive. And I think if you don't do them, you might not appreciate quite how resource intensive they are. Depending on the scope of a review, it can take anywhere from a year to 2 years to complete a review in a rigorous manner. And this is only made worse by the fact that the annual input of information in nutrition, but like across research across science and all the topics, you have increasing annual outputs of evidence. So this is just one bibliometric analysis of looking at papers related to healthy eating. And it has a doubling time of 5 years. And so you're just getting more and more evidence out there. And so the time it will take to perform systematic reviews will just increase with time. And so there are AI tools, and they're there to give us savings. They will save us workload. They will save us time. They will save us cost. And they can have an impact on results because they might change the statistical significance or effect estimates or conclusions that are drawn depending on the AI tool that you're using. We need to know that these AI tools are valid in terms of if you compare to a traditional systematic review, are you going to come out with the same results? And you can assess that validity looking at the precision, sensitivity, and specificity, et cetera, compared to the gold standard, which right now is humans. And I'm not sure about you, I'm not sure we're the gold standard, but that's where we're at. And then of course there's usability. We have these tools, but do they actually make our lives easier when we're going about doing systematic reviews? And so there was a workshop held last year, and this was based on a Gates-funded grant with Reagan Bailey, Patrick Sover, and Martha Field. And we held this workshop at the National Academies, and it was really looking at how can we use artificial intelligence and machine learning in evidence synthesis. That was one aspect of it. And then it was also how can you use AI to generate evidence in the nutrition sphere. And that's more along what Dr. Ordovez was talking about, but I'll focus on our discussion for evidence synthesis. So going back to the basics of a systematic review, there are specific steps that you go through. You have to refine your topic. So this is really, you're defining what your question is, and that defines the scope of the review. If your question is really broad, you're going to have 70,000 papers identified. And then the PICO, this is the population, the intervention or exposure, the comparator groups, the outcomes that you're interested in. So this is all how you refine the topic that's going to be included. Then you have the evidence identification. So based on your question and your PICO elements, you're going to develop a search strategy that will find the papers that are aligned or related to that topic. And then you have to take those thousands potentially of papers and screen them to find the ones that really aren't just kind of related to the topic, but are directly related to answering the question that you're asking. Once you have identified the relevant literature, you'll go through, you'll extract whatever the data is that you need, and then you'll perform a risk of bias analysis. So for any paper that's been included, you want to go through and say, okay, where are there study design issues that may contribute to bias in the results? And then you take all of that evidence together and you will do a narrative synthesis. If you have the relevant study and the relevant data, you can do a quantitative meta-analysis, and then you should ideally give a grade. So based on all the evidence you have, what is the certainty that that evidence, that finding is true? And there are already a lot of tools out there that can facilitate some of the steps related to the systematic reviews. So for refining your question or identifying the PICO elements, throw 5 key papers that you know are relevant to answering your question into ChatGPT, and you can ask, what's a good scientific question that's being answered by these papers? And it will pop out something, and then it's iterative, you can refine it. For the search, there are apps out there that you can throw in, again, your key 5 papers, and those apps will identify common terms across those papers, and then you can use those terms to then build your search strategy. So this is very useful. And then for anyone who's done screening, the common software that you use for systematic review, such as Distiller RS or Covidence, they have AI elements within them that as you're including papers and excluding others, it will train itself to then prioritize abstracts or papers that are more similar to the ones being included. They rise to the top. It makes for more efficient screening. So this is already in place. That's called daisy chaining, because because it daisy chains the highest priority papers to the top of the pile. Then for data extraction and risk of bias, there's something called chat PDF. You can throw in a PDF into this application and it will spit out a summary of the paper. Now, you could throw in 5 papers into chat PDF and ask it to summarize across, but the more papers you put in, the worse the results get. And then we have Robot Reviewer, which is the software that's an algorithm that's available. And I'll talk about this more in my case study, where it actually can do to some degree risk of bias evaluation. And then again, ChatGPT could be handy for those narrative synthesis. So we have these tools available. So I'm going to give a case study that was presented at the workshop at the National Academies. So this is coming from work by Byron Wallace, who was a participant there, and he is from Northeastern University. So it's based primarily on 2 papers that he's published with his collaborator, Ian Marshall. So the first thing is they've developed an algorithm called Trial Streamer, and this has resulted in the production of a living database of randomized controlled trials. And so what the algorithm does is it goes through and it scrapes PubMed, it scrapes clinical trial registries and a number of other databases, and then it compiles all of these. It reviews all of the papers that are identified, and then it classifies it either you're an RCT or you're not an RCT. And it's being updated on a daily basis. So this is truly a living database. So this is, if you go to the Trial Streamer website, it's queryable. So you now have an open access database where if you have an RCT or a question that could be answered by RCT kind of study designs, you just put in the population, the intervention, the comparator groups, the outcomes, or any one of those things, and it will produce a data set of all the RCTs that have those components in it. So this is great. It's really wonderful and again, publicly accessible. So Trial Streamer also goes to the next step. So it has this compiled database of RCTs, and it puts each of the RCTs that are identified through Robot Reviewer, which is the second AI algorithm. And what that does is it extracts sample size, pico elements of the studies. It performs a degree of risk of bias assessment, and it will summarize the main findings of the RCT. And so when you go into Trial Streamer and you click on any particular study, it actually gives you all of this information. So this is an example of the output of what you would get with included studies that have undergone the Trial Streamer and Robot Reviewer. And so you'll get the trial summary, you get the sample size, you get the pico elements, you get a bias, a judgment, and it will actually take out the supporting text that's used to make the judgment for the risk of bias. So that helps the reviewer to go in and hone in on the part of the text that might be relevant to that. And then it provides you with references as well. So in terms of the risk of bias, I'm not sure, again, if you've done a systematic review, you'd be familiar with risk of bias. Some of it's straightforward, some of it's a little bit more ambiguous and takes judgment. And so this would be the kind of output that comes out of Robot Reviewer. Now, there's some limitations here. Robot Reviewer is based on the Cochrane Risk of Bias 1. If you're familiar with systematic reviews, we now have the Cochrane Risk of Bias 2, which is slightly different, but there is commonality between the two. But it's not as updated as, it's not using the gold standard risk of bias tool for RCTs right now. And you'll notice it is only assessing 4 aspects of risk of bias. This is why I keep saying it's a partial risk of bias assessment. And that's because when Byron and his group, and they've published this paper, I should actually cite it here, they had assessments of all of the risk of bias components. And what they found was that the AI algorithm was really good at things like, is the study, did it use random sequence generation? Yes, no. Was there allocation concealment? Yes, no. Now, if you look at the other things that it doesn't include, it's things like, is there missing data? And Is there other bias? Those questions are a little bit more ambiguous, and the efficiency and effectiveness of the AI algorithm tanked. And so they just didn't include it here. So again, it's that context-specific aspect and the judgment that is required for those aspects of risk of bias, and the AI algorithm just was not successful at it. But if you're asking a yes/no question, it does quite well. So now they also have published living reviews based on these trial streamer and robot reviewer. And so basically, you have your trial streamer database. They had a broad topic related to COVID. It went through classification. And then what was classified as to be included was actually sent to a subject matter expert who then did a final yes/no. So it's almost like a second screener is the human. And then they produced a systematic review that now has automatic updates, and it's been trained on, what was the human actually including, and it's been trained, and so you can get this automatic update. So like we are getting close to living reviews that are almost human-free. So the opportunities for AI and evidence synthesis they're clear. Increased speed and decreased cost and human effort, which it's, having done a lot of evidence gap maps that had 70,000 papers, this is really helpful. We can imagine, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon, you can have living databases and reviews at your fingertips. But of course, I need to talk about the challenges, because there are a number of challenges. AI is a tool, and for now, it still requires at least human input and subject matter expertise. And so what are some of the challenges? So the challenges include accuracy and reliability. Have you ever asked ChatGPT something and it totally lied to you? Because I have. That's called AI hallucination. And so, you could ask it to do a summary of something and it lies its face off. Now, in the 6 months since I have started, it used to give me citations that actually, if you Googled them, didn't exist. But they were like correct author, correct time period, correct title. But you go and you're like, oh, wait a second, that's not actually real. Now, I did something similar to that a few days ago, and it actually gave me a link with a citation. So it's getting better. It is getting better, but it still lies to you. There's bias. The algorithm is only as good as the data set it was trained on. So if the training set was limited or biased in some way, that will be reflected in the output. You have to keep that in mind. There's no contextual understanding, and this goes back to those more ambiguous domains of risk of bias. It can't pull out, it doesn't understand the context or the nuance, and that's where subject matter expertise still, thank goodness, counts for something. Currency, it's only as good as the training set, again, and if the training set was based on data from 2 years ago, it's good for 2 years ago. And so, again, this is being improved when you have these training sets that are continuously being updated, the algorithms are being updated and they're learning, because that's what they do. They do get better, but this is a limitation. There are ethical concerns. Is it using data it should be using or data it shouldn't be using? Is there proprietary data that it doesn't have access to? So these are some issues. There's lack of transparency. So going back to the beginning, systematic review methodology, the whole thing is it's transparent. The algorithms, for the most part, unless it's an open access algorithm, they're a black box. So, and each one will be slightly different. And so that has impacts in terms of, we don't know how it's making the decisions it's making, and that can impact reproducibility. The same algorithm over time may evolve its outputs. So what you get the first time may not match the second time. And if you're using 2 different algorithms, you may not get the same answer twice. So these are some issues. Now, there's also challenges when you were thinking about the evidence synthesis part. And so when we talk about within a study, so these, again, these are the elements of a systematic review. It's developing the question, figuring out what the PICO elements are, the complexity of that task, and the judgment required to perform the task is fairly low. It can go in, it can extract that information. When you're making a grade, When you're making a narrative synthesis, that task is more complex, requires more judgment. And so the accuracy and reliability of the tools get wonkier the more of that's required. And then the savings might differ by subject matter. So this is evidence from Kristen Edwards. She was another participant at the workshop. And what she found was in a study where they were looking at the topic of agriculture, when she applied different models, different AI algorithms, they came up with they were improved, but they came up with different levels of improvement and different efficiency. But in nutrition, they both improved the same way. So it's, it's going to be different depending on the topic. And then you also have challenges across study design. So again, the tools I showed you were really about RCTs. There's clear-cut designs for an RCT. In nutrition and in food, we often rely on cohort studies, case control studies. And again, some of that ambiguity starts creeping in. What are the key confounders? Did they adjust for it? It gets harder, and the AI tools will suffer from that. And then, of course, there's authorship, there's the ethics of the use of it, and reporting. So we use our Prisma reporting checklists, but we need standardization of reporting for AI tools to really function well. So in summary, AI tools are already available, and they do increase the speed and decrease the cost of the systematic reviews, but over-reliance comes with risk, and that's because of the nature of the AI tools themselves, and we have to just acknowledge the limitations that they have. This is especially important when considering food and nutrition evidence, which often relies on those lower level study designs, the observational studies. So their future work, I'm sure, will address these challenges, but we will need validation of the AI tools in order to really incorporate them with confidence into our policymaking. So just acknowledgements of my collaborators, and that workshop was funded with a Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation grant.